December 1st, 2001, East Harlem, New York. It's a lively Saturday in El Barrio, also known as Spanish Harlem.
Harlem is a part of Manhattan, but there's one section of Harlem that's called Spanish Harlem, and it's a mixed blend of people from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, any kind of Spanish-speaking country.
El barrio is a word which means community. So in Spanish, the Latinos, when they talk about where they live, they'll say El barrio.
The whole block looked like Sesame Street. We had folks from all over, and it was very friendly.
But at one El Barrio home, NYPD is moving in for a welfare check on one of its residents.
They have reason to believe that 52-year-old Carmen Quinones is in trouble.
Earlier that day, after family had been trying to reach Carmen for nearly 24 hours, someone finally answered the landline. But it wasn't Carmen.
Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie, answered the phone.
As much as a 3-year-old could articulate what happened, she said, "Grandma's on the floor."
Since Carmen's family lives out of town, they immediately called the police to go over to the residence.
The officers responding knew this was a serious call.
But upon arriving at the residence, there's one sign of good news.
They're happy to discover that the little girl, that Natalie, is okay.
However, as officers make their way into the home, nothing can prepare them for the disturbing scene ahead.
They walked into the living room, and there on the floor was 2 people fatally stabbed.
Got a double homicide?
One of the victims is Carmen Quinones.
Puerto Rican immigrant Carmen Quinones embodied the essence of El Barrio.
Carmen was a very nice person. She knew people at the corner store. She knew her next door neighbors. Everybody pretty much knew who she was because of how kind she was.
When I needed somebody, Carmen was there. She was a wonderful lady.
Carmen was a very hard worker. She worked multiple jobs when she got to America.
Just in terms of some of her ability to pivot and learn another culture, another language, that just really speaks to her resilience.
And over the years, she saved up enough money to buy her own home, a beautiful brownstone in Spanish Harlem.
A brownstone, usually it's a 3-story building made out of brick. And it's divided 1st floor, 2nd floor, and 3rd floor.
Carmen decided to live on the ground floor apartment, and she rented the 2 top apartments.
Here's somebody who only a few years before came from Puerto Rico with nothing, and now she was buying a brownstone in New York City.
This American dream that most people come to America to fulfill, she did that.
So it was no surprise when she connected with a fellow immigrant, Justino de Jesus.
Justino de Jesus, he was a nice gentleman. He was also from Puerto Rico, so Carmen and him definitely had a lot in common when it came to that.
The two married in 1977 and had both a son and a daughter.
But as the years passed, the couple started growing apart.
The relationship between Carmen and Justino was on the rocks. They weren't getting along. Justino had a good job working for an elevator company, but then he lost his job.
Soon, even friends in the neighborhood could sense tension in the marriage.
When things got too much, he'd go and he'd be sitting on his soup in the night.
Carmen couldn't take the marriage anymore, and eventually they got divorced.
But the divorce was amicable, and Carmen even allowed Justino to stay in the brownstone.
She allowed him to move to the very top apartment on the 3rd floor of the same brownstone.
People didn't just jump up and leave a brownstone. It was more economical for them to stay together, split the expenses of the house. It was the most amicable separation.
So that plumbing in the bathroom's fixed.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. That's so helpful. And while you're here, do you mind the garbage disposal's kind of acting up? Can you check on that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
What's going on here?
He lived there rent-free, only to the condition where he just had to keep up with the maintenance of the entire brownstone. So in Carmen's eyes, she got in-house super, and she's able to work the apartment as a landlord.
Oh, where's Natalie?
Oh, I put her down for a nap.
Around that same time, Carmen's granddaughter Natalie had moved in with her while Natalie's mother was in school upstate.
However, just because she was a recently divorced grandmother, Carmen had not given up on living life to the fullest.
She started dating a fellow Puerto Rican immigrant from the community named Ruben Frederick.
When she first started going out with Ruben, she introduced me to him, and pretty soon he was just like anybody else coming in the block. He was very polite, very nice.
They went out all the time, they enjoyed each other's company, and he just loved Carmen, and she loved the attention that he gave her.
Ruben was kind, he was thoughtful, and he really seemed like the type of guy that Carmen could spend the rest of her life with.
A steady income, a beautiful home, and newfound romance. By 2001, Carmen Quiñones seemed to have it all. But now police in New York's 23rd precinct have found the 52-year-old grandmother deceased on her living room floor. And she isn't the only victim.
They determined the second victim to be Carmen's boyfriend, Ruben Frederick.
Carmen and Ruben have both suffered several stab wounds.
There wasn't much to go on except the basics. You have two people fatally stabbed inside a brownstone apartment, and police are now looking for a motive and the killer.
As night falls on Spanish Harlem, NYPD homicide detectives arrive to launch their investigation.
It was a horrific crime scene. It was blood all over the floor. On the walls, it was blood spatter. It was horrible, horrible.
Based on the condition of the bodies, detectives suspect the victims have been dead for about 20 hours.
When you have coagulation, it's thick and it's drying. So that means it's more than several hours that the body's been there. And to know that the little girl was there, it's just shocking. A horrible situation to be for a little girl.
The apartment is in disarray. There are drawers open, clothes everywhere. The apartment is completely ransacked.
Could this be a robbery gone wrong? Police examine the front door for more clues.
It didn't appear that the door was broken in any way, shape, or form, so the officers knew that somebody had to be let in to the apartment.
We haven't located any signs of forced entry.
Which raises one possible theory.
We were thinking that perhaps it was what was known as a push-in robbery, that you're accosted on the street, followed into the building, and then the horrific crime occurred inside the apartment.
But when police take a closer look at the bedroom, evidence suggests this isn't a typical break-in.
They picked up the mattress and they found a stash of cash. It was $16,000 in cash.
As soon as we saw $16,000, it struck us as very strange.
Did this strange find have something to do with what happened to the couple?
It looks like someone may have wanted that money. Someone dangerous.
New York detectives investigating the double homicide of 52-year-old Carmen Quiñones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick have just made a surprising discovery inside Carmen's bedroom.
They picked up the mattress and they found a stash of cash. It was $16,000 in cash.
It struck us as very strange. Right away we were thinking, could this be a gambling location? Could this be a narcotics location?
Can I get someone at the precinct to run a check on this address?
But those theories are quickly dispelled.
When we ran it through our computer system, nothing came up. The location was totally clean.
Background checks on Carmen and Ruben are clean as well.
They had never been in trouble before. No touch of anything with law enforcement whatsoever.
Both of them are exemplary citizens without even so much as a traffic ticket.
Hey, check this out.
And upon further investigation, detectives find a legitimate explanation for the cash.
We've recovered rent receipts that the money was from, rent being paid by the 2 tenants on the 2nd floor. And Carmen kept the money underneath his bed rather than put it in the bank. She just didn't trust banks.
With no signs of criminal activity or forced entry, detectives changed their focus.
This really kind of shifted the narrative to this could be something more personal.
But who could have targeted the happy couple in such a brutal attack? Police won't be able to get the answers they need from Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie.
You just cannot bare bone throw questions at a 3-year-old because their memory is different. They remember things differently, and they're still learning, and their brains are still developing. They don't know all the words, and they don't know how to explain what they saw.
So now detectives are looking to talk to neighbors to see if they heard anything, they saw anything, or if Carmen had any problems with anyone.
Of course, they want to speak to the residents that live upstairs, so they start on the 2nd floor.
When they speak to the tenant, he isn't able to offer much help. He can't imagine who would want to hurt Carmen.
She was very sweet, but, she kept to herself like most people around her.
They were very surprised, shocked. They said it was, a quiet block, a good block.
The tenant also says he didn't hear anything the night before because he wasn't home.
I was at work. My supervisor could vouch for that.
He had a solid alibi. He was not in the home at the time of the murders.
The investigators hope they'll have more luck with the 3rd-story residents. But when they ask for more information on them, they're thrown for a loop.
They find out that there's a gentleman living on the 3rd floor who happens to be Carmen's ex-husband.
Detectives were a little surprised to find out that Carmen's ex-husband lived up on the 3rd floor.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but, they seem to make it work.
And detectives are even more surprised to find out that Carmen's ex, Justino de Jesus, doesn't live there alone.
The 3rd floor, it was Justino and his new wife, Maria.
This immediately sets off alarm bells for the detectives.
The officers definitely thought that was quite interesting and also kind of odd. Where in the world does the ex-husband and their new wife live in the same home as the ex-wife?
We didn't know who did it. I mean, everybody's considered a suspect.
As NYPD investigates the fatal stabbings of Carmen Quiñones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick, the tight-knit neighborhood of Spanish Harlem remains stunned.
I was really shocked. I kept saying, why somebody want to torture them? They were human. They were people.
But after discovering Carmen's ex-husband Justino and his new wife Maria live upstairs in the 3rd-floor apartment, investigators are wondering if this attack may have come from inside the home.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but, they seem to make it work.
Per the report of the neighbors, there was never any inclination of anything that would warrant a second look at them.
They kind of lived amicably. I mean, there was no arguing. They just learned how to live with each other.
Just as police set out to find them, Justino and Maria arrive outside the residence.
What's going on?
He came home and he was going, whoa, what's this?
We need to talk. There's been a homicide.
So as the officers are talking to Justino and Maria, they let them know that Carmen and Ruben are dead.
What? That can't be. We're gonna need both of you to come with us to answer some questions.
In the beginning, everybody's considered a suspect.
They both seem really upset, but they agree to go back to the station with the investigators.
They interviewed them separately in different rooms. They wanted to make sure they both told the same story.
Detectives sit down with Justino first, and he seems genuinely shocked by what's transpired.
I just can't believe it.
He was like, no, it can't be. There's no way anybody that I know is involved in killing Carmen.
He lets them know that they are still friends, that he had no reason to harm her, and certainly not harm her knowing that his granddaughter is in the apartment with her.
But investigators aren't letting Justino off the hook just yet.
Police believe the murders took place on November 30th, so where was Justino during that time?
And can you attest for your whereabouts on November 30th?
Yeah, absolutely.
Justino claims that both he and his wife were out all day.
They had alibis. Justino was working, Maria was out doing errands.
And Justino says when they returned home, nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
As far as I could tell, everything seemed normal with the house.
He didn't see or hear anything that would indicate a murder had taken place inside the residence.
In the next room, Justino's wife Maria corroborates her husband's statement.
It was a busy day for me. I had a lot of errands to run.
I remember she said that she went to pick up some glasses, reading glasses, and she had to do a couple of stops. And then she returned home.
They believed she didn't know anything.
Justino and Maria also agree to let the police search their third-floor apartment.
They don't find a murder weapon, they don't find any blood, they don't find anything that indicates that these two individuals had anything to do with the crime that occurred downstairs.
So now detectives are stymied. They don't have any motive, no suspects.
Is it possible Carmen's boyfriend, Ruben Frederick, was the true target of this brutal crime?
They've looked at everything that they could possibly look at on Carmen's side, so now they have to determine what's the deal with Ruben.
They saw that he was a bus driver for a private company, and then they found out that he lived in Brooklyn.
And that's when they make a shocking new discovery.
To their surprise, he does not live alone in Brooklyn.
They determined that Ruben is actually married.
There's some kind of, love triangle.
New York homicide detectives investigating the brutal double homicide of Carmen Quinones and her boyfriend, Ruben Frederick, have just uncovered a surprising new twist in the case.
Investigators discovered that Ruben is married to a woman who lives in Brooklyn. So now they have to look into this person.
At the same time he's dating Carmen, he has a wife back at home.
There's some kind of, love triangle.
Later that day, detectives sit down with Ruben's wife, Gloria.
They ask her about Ruben. She says, yeah, that's my husband.
I'm afraid we have some unfortunate news.
They tell her that Ruben was, fatally stabbed to death. She was surprised, upset, and they add that he was found dead in the apartment of his girlfriend.
No wonder I couldn't get a hold of him.
But Gloria doesn't seem particularly shocked to hear that her husband was with another woman.
She told police that, he had several girlfriends over the years during their marriage.
She knew he was a player, Playa, and she more or less sort of accepted it.
But I still loved him regardless.
According to Gloria, on the day of the murders, Ruben told her he was working.
I thought he was at the bus company.
He told his wife he was going to work a triple shift, and that was to cover up where he was really going to be, which was at Carmen's apartment.
And when detectives ask Gloria where she was that day, she's able to provide an alibi.
I was with my friends. They can vouch for me.
They were able to confirm that pretty quickly. So now they were back to square one.
After speaking with Gloria, detectives called the bus company to speak with Ruben's manager.
I called them up and I said, listen, I need help.
They start getting information from the boss about Ruben's shift, how often he worked there.
Ruben's boss assures police he was a reliable employee who got along with everyone.
As far as they knew, he had no enemies. They couldn't offer police any motive of who would want to kill him.
But in passing, Ruben's boss mentioned something that catches their attention.
The boss said, do you have his cell phone?
Ruben had a phone from the company. He used it all the time.
And so now the police are wondering, what cell phone? They didn't find one in the home.
I went back. I'm looking for something that said cell phone from the scene. There was none. So I'm like, where is this phone?
Ruben's boss gives the detectives the phone number. So the police subpoena the records of the phone.
And when the records come in, detectives know they're on the right track.
A few days later, they call me. They said, we have phone calls from that phone. I said, okay. Is the phone still active? They said yes. And we have several phone calls that were dialed out of the phone after the murders. And they said, whoa, wow, that's interesting.
Obviously, it was not made by Ruben because he was dead. So now they were trying to figure out who was using this phone and who were they calling.
Detectives contact the recipients of those calls to ask who called them from that number.
Each phone call recipient gives the same name, Carlos Diaz.
Now, who the heck is Carlos Diaz?
Detectives run Carlos's name through their system.
Carlos Diaz doesn't have a record of any significance. He's not, a heavy hitter.
They see he got some arrests, mostly petty crimes, but they figure if he has Ruben's phone, he's the killer.
They feel like they've hit the jackpot at this point. And now this person is taken into custody.
Once they get Carlos in an interrogation room, detectives turn up the heat.
They're asking him, do you know Carmen? Do you know Ruben? And he's looking at them like, who are these people?
I don't know what you're talking about, man. Now you find this in your pocket.
But when detectives confront him about Ruben's phone, Carlos has an explanation.
I was going to clone it. It just haven't gotten around it yet.
He lets them know that he's a phone cloner, meaning that he takes the SIM card out of one phone and puts it into another phone and uses the minutes up on that one and transfer that SIM card to another one.
Back then, they would clone the phone and they would bang out thousands of dollars worth of calls and then get rid of it.
It gives people the ability to, use the phone without having to pay for the service.
Okay, that still doesn't explain how you got Ruben's phone.
The point is, he has the SIM card belonging to Ruben, and the police are wondering, well, where'd you get this from?
He thinks he's just there for a phone that he cloned. I said, no, you're not here because of a phone. You're here because that phone belonged to two people that were murdered.
Murder?
He goes, let me tell you, detective, I might be a lot of things, but I'm not a murderer.
All right, listen. I got this for another guy a few days ago. A guy who goes by Doggy.
He said, Doggy gave it to me. I said, Doggy? Who's Doggy? He said, he lives in my neighborhood. He wanted this phone cloned.
What's Doggy's real name? His name is Rafael Rios.
Sure enough, he identifies him. Rafael Rios.
What does he have to do with Carmen and Ruben's murder?
That's when Carlos drops another name.
He says Rafael gave him instructions to hand the cloned phone over to another man from the neighborhood named Raymond Mundo.
Now detectives have not one, but two additional suspects on their hands.
What do you know about this Raymond guy? That's the one you don't mess around with.
He said, like, Raymond's a real bad guy. He's, like, a little afraid of him. He even said, I was going to clone the phone for free.
When detectives poll Raymond's criminal history, they see that Carlos is telling the truth.
Raymond has recently been released from prison after serving 6 years.
And the crime sounds eerily familiar.
He did a home invasion with a knife. When we saw his MO and what he did, we was like, this is the guy.
Nearly a week after Carmen Quinones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick were fatally stabbed to death, New York investigators have unearthed 2 new suspects in the crime, Rafael Rios and Raymond Mundo.
Both men have a criminal record, but there's something in Raymond's rap sheet that really stands out to investigators.
Raymond has recently been released after serving 6 years in prison for an eerily similar crime.
He did a home invasion with a knife. When we saw his MO and what he did, we was like, this is the guy.
But other than their involvement with Ruben's phone, what's Raymond and Rafael's connection to the murdered couple?
If they're the killers, why did they do it?
At that point, we were just concentrating on these 2 people from the Bronx, and we needed to know why.
Police immediately move in to locate the 2 suspects.
Rafael and Raymond happen to live in the same building.
Raymond is nowhere to be found. However, they are able to locate Rafael and bring him in for questioning.
At the station, detectives press Rafael about his involvement in the murders, but he refuses to talk.
I don't know what you're talking about.
This guy is not bending, and I don't think they expected him to. He's been down this road of being questioned by the police before. He knows what to say and what not to say.
But eventually, Rafael starts to realize his stonewalling isn't going to work.
We break it down, and I said, listen, there was a double homicide in East Harlem, and it points out that you have the phone that belonged to one of the victims. So that's when he kind of realizes that he's not going anywhere right now.
Come on, Rafael, it's time to tell the truth.
So I said, just tell me what happened.
Okay.
So he basically says, Mundo and I went to East Harlem, and we did this crime.
He gave a 10-page written confession. He gave up the whole thing.
Rafael says on November 30th, he and Raymond posed as detectives to sneak into Carmen Quinones' brownstone.
They said police. So Carmen opened the door slightly.
Yes?
They were dressed in, like suits or shirt and tie, so to look the part, And they had pads like they were detectives, taking notes.
With the NYPD, can we come in?
Rafael says that's when Carmen sensed something wasn't right.
She went to slam the door, but it was too late.
She let her guard down, and that was a fatal mistake. That was the beginning of the end.
Before she could even say anything, Raymond stabs her in the chest with a knife and pushes his way into the apartment. Ruben, who's in the back room, hears all this. He comes running in, and he starts fighting with the 2 men.
Even though Ruben is outnumbered, he puts up quite a fight.
Ruben was very agile, and he was no slouch. He was a built man.
They had a team up on him.
They finish them off, stab them until they're not breathing anymore.
Carmen and Ruben are each stabbed over 20 times.
Shortly thereafter, the killers realized there was someone else in the apartment, Carmen's 3-year-old granddaughter, Natalie.
When they spotted the little girl in the apartment, they were shocked. So they spoke amongst each other and said, what are we gonna do?
Rafael said, she's little, she didn't see anything, she doesn't know us, so they decide, instead of killing the little girl, they'll tie her up with duct tape.
They taped her up and sat her down in front of a television to be found by the police later on.
By the grace of God, she was able to untie herself, and 20 hours later, she was able to pick up that phone.
But there's still one big question on the minds of investigators. Why?
They believe the story as far as the facts of how this murder played out, but they still need the answers to the ultimate question.
How did they plan this? Who else was involved?
That's when Raphael drops the ultimate bombshell.
This was a contract hire, and they were only supposed to kill Carmen at the orders of Maria de Jesus.
He said, Maria. I said, Maria. He goes, yeah, upstairs, Maria, third floor. I mean, we were shocked.
One week after beloved grandmother Carmen Quinones and her boyfriend Ruben Frederick were found brutally stabbed to death, New York detectives have a 10-page confession from one of the killers.
Rafael Rios said he was paid to kill Carmen by her ex-husband's new wife, Maria de Jesus.
He said, Maria. I said, Maria. He goes, yeah, upstairs, Maria, third floor. I mean, we were shocked.
She was like this little short, I don't even think she was 5 feet tall.
You have this person who is presenting as this sweet lady, and so they moved on because her disposition didn't raise any red flags.
I knew of Maria and Justino, of course, but their involvement, I'm like, no, it can't be.
However, the more Raphael talks, the more detectives believe him. Raphael explains he first met Maria de Jesus years ago when they were neighbors.
Maria lived in the same building that Mundo and Doggy lived in the Bronx. That's how she knew them. That's how she knew they were bad guys.
So when Maria needed hitmen to carry out her sordid plan, she knew just where to find them.
He said she came over to the Bronx, looked for us, and she said, I need somebody killed. And I'll pay a lot of money.
She offered to pay $15,000 for it.
They were paid to kill Carmen, and unfortunately, Ruben was there too. He wasn't supposed to be there, you know, and he paid the price with his life.
But why did Maria want Carmen killed in the first place?
I'm like, why? He goes, I don't know. I think she doesn't like her. I said, wow, it's pretty deep. And he goes, I don't know. I think something happened a long time ago.
But before investigators move in on Maria, there's one more person they need to find. Raphael's accomplice, Raymond Mundo.
They eventually locate him 135 miles away in Connecticut.
We knew that he was in Connecticut because we had tracked his cell phone there.
However, Raymond isn't going down easy.
When Raymond spots the police, he takes off and tries to carjack a vehicle from a pregnant woman.
He opens the door, tries to grab her out of the car. By that time, we all surrounded him.
Hands in the air! Hands in the air!
Finally, Raymond realizes his time is up.
We hook him up, we cuff him, and then he was brought into the Connecticut State Police. He realized the gig was up because his accomplice confessed.
After receiving a nearly identical confession from Raymond, police begin digging deeper into Maria de Jesus' involvement.
The detectives definitely have enough information here to arrest both Raymond and Raphael. They don't have enough information to arrest Maria because Maria's only being pulled into this on the word of a convicted criminal.
So they continued to work the case to try and get more evidence on Maria.
We needed more evidence. We needed bank records. We needed phone records.
And in Maria's bank records, something quickly catches detectives' attention.
The bank records showed that she had withdrawn in 2 increments, but totaling $15,000 around the same time that Raphael said this payment was made to them.
There's no way that's just a coincidence in their eyes.
On June 4th, police finally move in to arrest Maria de Jesus at the same brownstone where Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick were brutally murdered.
We knew she was there. So I kept on pressing the buzzer. Maria, it's Detective Rivera, we need to talk. She finally answered.
Hello?
I said, Maria, you're under arrest, you have to come. She says, okay. I think she was waiting because she thought maybe she was gonna get that knock on the door, and she did.
She was that small little woman that they wrote off immediately in the top of the investigation. And she's living rent-free in a home, so like, what's the issue that Carmen had to be killed by her, and for $15,000 nonetheless?
Prosecutors finally answer that question when Maria stands trial 2 years later, revealing a major piece of the puzzle. Justino and Maria had been a couple before Carmen came into the picture.
The motive in this case is pure jealousy. Turns out, all those years ago, before Carmen and Justino got married, he had been dating Maria.
Maria dated Justino when they were young. We believe that she was still mad at Carmen because Carmen married Justino. When Carmen and Justino couldn't be together anymore for whatever reasons, he got back with Maria and they married.
And since Carmen and Justino have a rent-free arrangement, Maria had to live in the same building as her arch-nemesis.
The fact that she had to see this woman every day, I don't know, that's a big grudge to have.
To prove that Maria was the mastermind behind the murders, prosecutors present her bank records to the court.
They had the bank receipts that she took out $15,000.
And that payment matched up with the agreed upon amount for this murder for hire.
This was a contract killing.
Maria, she wanted that brownstone, and it was just something that she thought she could get away with. And she set this plot in motion.
But most damning of all is Rafael Rios's testimony.
Raphael makes a plea deal with the prosecution to testify against Maria, and his testimony is really the nail in her coffin.
She's convicted of murdering Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick. She's sentenced to life without parole.
She may not have been the one who did the stabbing, but she's the one who was the mastermind.
But while Maria de Jesus is convicted of the merciless crime, investigators are convinced her husband Justino had nothing to do with it.
No one could ever find any nexus between Justino and the ill-fated, devious plans of Maria, She was just an evil gargoyle, that woman.
As for Raymond Mundo, he's tried separately and also found guilty.
He goes to trial, and he's ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So Maria and Raymond are sentenced to life without parole, but due to his cooperation, Raphael only gets 23 years. Is it enough? That's still up for debate.
This act was pure evil, powered by hatred, pure hatred.
This murder of Carmen Quinones and Ruben Frederick was, it was a horrific case. It is one of those cases that stays with you, stays with you for the rest of your life.
It's just a lot of loss. You can never be too sure about the company that you keep.
On an ordinary afternoon in November 2021, the roads of North Charleston, South Carolina, carried the usual rhythm of American life. Cars moved along the highways. People were heading home from work, picking up their children, running errands, making plans for the evening. For most drivers, it was just another day. Another commute. Another series of turns and exits that would be forgotten by nightfall. But on one stretch of road, a few seconds of anger would change everything. A moment that should have ended with two drivers exchanging words, perhaps an insurance claim, perhaps a frustrated gesture in traffic, became something far darker. It became a chain of decisions that could never be undone. A chain that ended with a mother losing her life, a child losing the person who meant everything to her, and a community left asking the same painful question again and again. How does a simple disagreement on the road become murder? How does a stranger's anger become another family's tragedy? And how does someone who was never part of the conflict become the person who pays the ultimate price? Christina Brittany Colon was not looking for trouble that day. She was not behind the wheel. She was not the person arguing with another driver. She was not the reason two vehicles crossed paths. She was simply sitting inside a car, traveling through North Charleston, sharing an ordinary moment with people she cared about. But ordinary moments can disappear in an instant. The people inside that vehicle could not have known that the next few minutes would become the final chapter of Christina's life. They could not have known that a road dispute between two men would transform into a violent confrontation. They could not have known that the sound of gunfire would replace the normal sounds of traffic, that panic would replace routine, and that a 7-year-old child would experience a memory no child should ever have to carry. A mother's voice. A mother's presence. A mother's protection. All taken away in a matter of seconds. The tragedy of Christina Colon's death was not just that a life was lost. It was that the life lost belonged to someone who had no role in the conflict that surrounded her. Her death represented one of the most disturbing realities of road rage incidents. Violence does not always find the person who caused the anger. Sometimes it finds the innocent person sitting nearby. Sometimes it reaches through a car window and takes away someone who never even knew they were in danger. The story begins on November 4, 2021. The day started like many others for Christina. She was 32 years old, a woman who had built relationships, created memories, and become an important part of the lives of those around her. To the outside world, she was one person among millions. But to her family, she was irreplaceable. She was a daughter. She was a mother. She was someone whose absence would leave a space that could never be filled again. On that day, Christina was traveling in a vehicle driven by Austin Blaine Faltermeyer. Her young daughter was also inside the car. At that moment, the three of them were simply moving through their day. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. No warning that a stranger's frustration would soon become a deadly threat. The road ahead looked ordinary. The traffic looked ordinary. The afternoon seemed ordinary. Until another vehicle entered the picture. According to investigators, the situation began with a traffic-related incident involving Faltermeyer's vehicle and another vehicle driven by Parker Norman Gore. The details of the initial encounter were not the kind of thing that should ever lead to a person losing their life. A collision. A disagreement. A moment of frustration between strangers. But road rage is often not about the original event. It is about what happens inside a person's mind after the event. A driver may feel disrespected, challenged, humiliated, angry. A small mistake can become, in someone's imagination, a personal attack. The road becomes more than a road. The other driver becomes more than a stranger. A simple mistake becomes a battle. And when anger combines with impulsive decisions and access to a weapon, the consequences can become irreversible. That day, two vehicles became connected by a conflict that continued to escalate. One driver wanted to leave. Another driver followed. A disagreement became a pursuit. and a pursuit became a deadly confrontation. Some tragedies happen because of carefully planned actions. Others happen because someone allows a single moment of emotion to control everything that comes afterward. The case of Christina Colon belongs to the second category. There was no long history of revenge between strangers. No complicated criminal plot. No years-long feud leading to a final confrontation. Instead, there was a road. 2 vehicles. A moment of anger. And a decision that changed multiple lives forever. As the vehicles moved through North Charleston, the situation became more dangerous. What should have been resolved by distance and time instead moved closer toward violence. The space between frustration and tragedy became smaller with every passing second. Inside the car, Christina remained trapped in a situation she did not create. Her daughter was there. A child who should have been thinking about normal childhood things. A child who should have been worrying about school, friends, games, or what she would do later that day. Instead, she would become the witness to something no child should ever see. A mother's final moments. A moment of fear. A moment of confusion. A moment that would remain forever. When the shots were fired, the world of Christina's family changed instantly. The bullet that struck Christina did not only take one life. It created countless wounds that could not be seen. It left a child without her mother. It left relatives with questions that would never have satisfying answers. It left a community struggling to understand how something so meaningless could produce such devastating consequences. Christina Colon became another name added to the growing list of victims of road rage violence in America. But behind every name is a person. Behind every headline is a family. Behind every statistic is a story that continues after the cameras leave and the investigation ends. Christina was not a symbol. She was not simply a victim in a crime report. She was a real person with memories, relationships, dreams, and a future that was stolen from her. The tragedy is not only that she died. The tragedy is that she should still be here. She should have watched her daughter grow older. She should have experienced ordinary days that families often take for granted. She should have had more birthdays, more conversations, more moments that seemed small, but later would have meant everything. Instead, her family was forced to confront an impossible reality. A woman who left home that day would not return. A child who entered a vehicle with her mother would leave without her. And 2 strangers' anger on a road would become the reason an entire family's future changed forever. The investigation into Christina Colon's death would reveal the frightening speed at which anger can transform into violence. It would raise questions about responsibility, accountability, and the dangerous consequences of refusing to walk away. Because sometimes the most terrifying crimes do not begin with hatred. They begin with impatience. They begin with pride. They begin with a person deciding that being angry matters more than being careful. And on November 4, 2021, in North Charleston, one of those decisions created a tragedy that would never be forgotten. This is the story of Christina Brittany Colon. A mother. A daughter. A woman who became the innocent victim of someone else's rage. A story about a road that became a crime scene. A confrontation that should never have happened. And a few seconds that destroyed everything. North Charleston, South Carolina, is a city built around movement. It is a place where roads connect neighborhoods, businesses, military facilities, airports, and communities that stretch across the coastal region. Every day, thousands of people travel through its streets and highways carrying the invisible weight of ordinary life. They drive to work. They take children to school. They visit family members. They make plans for the evening. They hurry because they are late, slow down because traffic is heavy, and continue forward without thinking about how fragile a normal day can truly be. Like many cities across America, North Charleston is shaped by its highways. Roads are not just paths between destinations. They are the places where millions of small human interactions happen every day. Every lane change, every merge, every brake light, and every passing vehicle represents a brief encounter between strangers. Most of those encounters mean nothing. A driver cuts someone off, and both people move on. A car moves too slowly, and another driver simply passes. Someone makes a mistake, someone becomes frustrated, and within minutes, the moment disappears. But sometimes, a moment does not disappear. Sometimes, someone holds on to the anger. Sometimes, a person decides that a few seconds of frustration are worth turning into a confrontation. And that is where ordinary situations become dangerous. The road where Christina Colan's final moments unfolded was not a dark alley or an isolated location. It was not a place where people expected violence. It was part of a modern American transportation system, a place filled with vehicles, movement, and everyday life. That is what made the case so unsettling. The danger did not come from a hidden location. It came from an ordinary road. The events of November 4, 2021, began in an environment that looked completely normal. The weather, the traffic, the sounds of engines passing and tires moving across pavement created the familiar background of any afternoon commute. People around the area were focused on their own lives. Some were thinking about dinner. Some were finishing their workday. Some were simply trying to get home. No one looking at the road that day would have imagined that a violent crime was about to take place. No one watching the vehicles pass would have known that inside one of them was a mother whose life was about to end. Christina Brittany Colan was not traveling through North Charleston expecting danger. She was not entering a situation connected to crime or conflict. She was simply a passenger on a normal trip. Her daughter was with her. For a 7-year-old child, the world is usually defined by simple things. Family. Safety. Familiar voices. The comfort of knowing that a parent is nearby. A child's understanding of the world depends heavily on the belief that adults can protect them. That day, that belief would be shattered. To understand the tragedy of Christina's death, it is important to understand the environment that allowed it to happen. Road rage is often misunderstood, because people imagine anger behind the wheel as nothing more than shouting or aggressive driving. Many people have experienced frustration in traffic. A driver may honk their horn. Someone may make an angry gesture. A person may complain about another driver's mistake. Those moments are common. But road rage becomes something different when emotions overpower judgment. A vehicle can become more than transportation. For some people, it becomes a space where they feel protected from consequences. Surrounded by metal and glass, separated from strangers by a windshield, a driver may feel anonymous and powerful. A person who would never confront someone face-to-face in a parking lot may suddenly feel willing to chase another vehicle, block another driver, or escalate a disagreement. The highway creates distance, but it can also create a dangerous illusion of control. Every driver is making decisions in seconds. Every emotion can become amplified. Every mistake can become personal. In Christina Colan's case, investigators believed that a traffic dispute between Austin Blaine Faltermeyer and Parker Norman Gore escalated beyond a simple disagreement. The initial collision or interaction between their vehicles became the beginning of a chain of events that eventually led to gunfire. The details of the first moments are important because they reveal how quickly a normal situation can transform. There was no indication that Christina had any involvement in the original conflict. She was not the person behind the wheel. She was not the person exchanging anger with another driver. She was not making decisions that pushed the confrontation forward. Yet she became the person who suffered the greatest consequence. This is one of the most disturbing patterns seen in road rage cases. The person who dies is not always the person who caused the disagreement. The victim may be a passenger, a child, another driver who happens to be nearby, someone who simply enters the wrong place at the wrong time. Violence rarely follows the rules people expect. It does not always target the person responsible. It does not always make sense. And that is why these cases leave such a lasting impact. The story of Christina Colon forces people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Safety can disappear in a moment. A routine drive can become a life-changing event. A person can leave home believing they will return in a few hours, only for their family to receive devastating news instead. As the afternoon continued on November 4th, Christina sat inside the vehicle with no reason to believe she was in danger. She may have been thinking about her daughter. She may have been thinking about plans for later. She may have been having a completely ordinary conversation. Those small details are impossible to fully recover, because tragedy often destroys the final moments that come before it. Investigators can reconstruct movements. They can examine vehicles. They can collect evidence. They can determine what happened physically. But they cannot recreate the thoughts of someone during the final peaceful minutes, before their world changes forever. That is one of the cruelest parts of sudden violence. The victim does not know they are living through their final ordinary moment. Christina did not know that the drive she was taking would become the last journey of her life. Her daughter did not know that the person sitting beside her would soon be gone. The people around them on the road did not know they were witnessing the beginning of a tragedy. The city continued moving. Cars continued passing. People continued their routines. And somewhere within that ordinary flow of traffic, anger was building. The conflict between two drivers was no longer just frustration. It was becoming something more dangerous. Each decision created another consequence. Each second brought the vehicles closer to an outcome that could never be reversed. For Parker Norman Gore, the confrontation would eventually lead to criminal charges and accusations that he made the decision to use a firearm during a road rage incident. For Austin Blaine Faltermeyer, the events would also lead to legal consequences and questions about his actions during the confrontation. But before investigators, prosecutors, and courts examined responsibility, there was only the moment itself. A road. Two vehicles. A mother and child caught in the middle. And a situation that should have ended long before anyone was hurt. The tragedy of Christina Colon's death was not created by one single second. It was created by a series of choices. The choice to continue. The choice not to walk away. The choice to allow anger to control behavior. By the time the confrontation reached its most violent point, the outcome was already moving beyond anyone's ability to stop it. The road that was supposed to take Christina somewhere else became the place where her life ended. And for the people who loved her, North Charleston would never again be just a city. It would forever be the place where they lost Christina. The place where an ordinary day became unforgettable. The place where a few moments of rage created a lifetime of grief, before Christina Brittany Colon became a name in a police report, before her story appeared in news headlines, before her death became connected to a conversation about road rage and violence. She was simply Christina. A woman with her own memories. A mother with her own dreams. A person whose life was not defined by the way it ended. In many tragic cases, the victim becomes remembered only through the circumstances of their death. Their name becomes connected to a crime scene, an investigation, a courtroom, and a painful collection of facts. But every victim has a story that began long before the tragedy. There were years before the final day. There were moments of happiness, struggles overcome, relationships built, and countless ordinary experiences that shaped who they were. Christina Brittany Colon was 32 years old when her life was taken away. 32 years may sound like a long time to some people, but it is still only the beginning of many stories. At that age, many people are still building their future. They are watching their children grow. They are creating new memories. They are discovering who they are and who they want to become. Christina was still in that process. She was still living. Still planning. Still loving. Still being a mother. The tragedy of her death becomes even more painful when we remember that she was not a person who walked into danger. She was not someone looking for conflict. She was not involved in a dispute that belonged to her. She was a passenger. A mother sitting inside a vehicle. A person who believed she would arrive at her destination. Like so many people who leave home every day, Christina likely expected nothing more dramatic than a normal trip. She expected the kind of day that would eventually become a memory of routine. A drive. A conversation. A few hours passing before returning to whatever came next. But life is often measured by the moments we believe are insignificant. A conversation in a car. A laugh shared with a loved one. A simple glance toward a child. A normal afternoon that no one realizes will become the last. Those are the moments families hold onto after someone is gone. After Christina's death, her family was left with the impossible task of remembering someone whose future had been stolen. They were forced to look backward, because they could no longer look forward. They could no longer imagine what Christina would do next. They could only remember what she had already given them. The greatest tragedy in cases like this is not only the loss of a person's life. It is the loss of everything that person would have experienced. The birthdays Christina would not celebrate. The conversations she would never have. The milestones she would miss. The moments with her daughter that would never happen. A mother's relationship with her child is built through thousands of small interactions. It is not created in one grand moment. It is created through everyday life. The way a mother comforts her child after a bad day. The way she remembers small details. The way she protects them. The way her presence creates a feeling of home. For Christina's 7-year-old daughter, that connection was suddenly broken in the most traumatic way imaginable. A child who should have remembered her mother's kindness, her voice, her smile, and the comfort of being loved was instead forced to experience a moment of violence that would forever separate them. The emotional damage of such a loss cannot be measured only by the day someone dies. The consequences continue afterward. They appear in the empty chair at home. In the unanswered questions. In the moments when a child wants to share something with a parent who is no longer there. The absence of a loved one is not always loud. Sometimes it appears quietly. In a phone that will never ring again. In a message that will never be answered. In a familiar routine that suddenly feels incomplete. Christina's life was important because she was important to people around her. She was not just a victim of a crime. She was someone's daughter. Someone's friend. Someone's family member. Most importantly, she was a mother. And motherhood was one of the most significant parts of her identity. The relationship between Christina and her daughter represented something that existed long before that terrible day. It was built over years of care, patience, affection, and shared experiences. The child who sat beside her during that drive was not just a passenger in the vehicle. She was the center of Christina's world. A mother's instinct is often to protect her child from danger. But on that day, Christina was placed in a situation where she could not protect herself. She could not predict what was coming. She could not stop the actions of another person. She could not understand that a stranger's anger would soon enter her life. That is one of the most painful elements of this case. Christina was not given a chance. She was not involved in the argument. She did not make the decisions that led to the confrontation. She was simply there when another person's anger reached a deadly point. The phrase, "wrong place at the wrong time," is often used when describing tragedies like this. But in Christina's case, those words feel painfully incomplete. Because she was not just in the wrong place. She was where she was supposed to be. She was with her child. She was traveling. She was living her life. The danger came from someone else's decision. Road rage cases often reveal something disturbing about human behavior. People can become trapped in a moment of anger and lose sight of the fact that everyone around them is a real person with a life just as valuable as their own. The other driver is not just an obstacle. The other car is not just a machine. The person inside has a family. They have people waiting for them. They have a story. Christina Colon had a story. And that story deserved to continue. The woman remembered by those who loved her was not defined by fear or tragedy. She was defined by the relationships she built and the love she gave. The headlines may focus on the shooting, the investigation, and the criminal charges, but behind all of those details was a person who mattered. A person whose life had meaning before the crime ever happened. When investigators reconstructed the events of November 4, 2021, they focused on vehicles, timelines, evidence, and actions. Those details were necessary to understand what happened. But the reason the investigation mattered was because someone was gone. A human being had been taken away. A family had been changed forever. The purpose of justice was not simply to determine what happened on the road. It was also to recognize what was lost. Christina's death was not just the result of a traffic confrontation. It was the loss of a future. It was the loss of a mother's presence. It was the loss of thousands of moments that would never come. The cruel irony is that Christina's final moments were spent doing something completely ordinary. She was riding in a car. Something millions of people do every day. There was no reason for her to believe that danger was approaching. No reason to think that a stranger's anger would reach her. No reason to imagine that she would not return home. But tragedy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it begins with something as small as a disagreement between drivers. And sometimes, it takes away someone who was never part of the fight. Christina Brittany Colon's story is not only about how she died. It is about how she lived. It is about remembering that before she became the victim of a road rage shooting, she was a woman who loved and was loved. She was a mother whose child needed her. She was a person with a future ahead of her. And on November 4, 2021, that future was taken away in a moment of violence that should never have happened. On November 4, 2021, the road was supposed to be nothing more than a path from one place to another. For most people traveling through North Charleston that day, the highway was simply part of their routine. Vehicles moved in predictable patterns. Drivers watched traffic signals, checked mirrors, changed lanes, and continued toward their destinations. But somewhere within that familiar rhythm, tension began to build. A disagreement between two drivers started what would become a deadly chain of events. At first, it was only a traffic incident. Something that, under different circumstances, might have ended within minutes. A collision. A frustrated reaction. A conversation between strangers. An exchange of insurance information. Then everyone would have gone their separate ways. That is how these moments are supposed to end. But this time, it did not. Instead of the situation fading away, emotions intensified. A brief encounter on the road became a confrontation. A disagreement became personal. And as the vehicles continued moving, the danger continued growing. Inside one of those vehicles was Christina Brittany Colon. She was not the person involved in the original dispute. She was not driving. She was not the person making decisions that would push the situation forward. She was simply sitting in the passenger seat, with her 7-year-old daughter nearby. At that moment, Christina was living through an ordinary part of life. She was traveling in a car. She was with her child. Nothing about the situation suggested that she was moments away from becoming the victim of a violent crime. That is what makes sudden violence so devastating. The victims rarely know they are approaching the final moments of their lives. There is no warning. No announcement. No moment when the world pauses and tells someone, everything is about to change. Life continues normally until suddenly it does not. According to investigators, the events began when the vehicle driven by Austin Blaine Faltermeyer was involved in a traffic-related incident with a vehicle operated by Parker Norman Gore. The exact emotions that passed between the two drivers in those first moments are impossible to fully understand. Investigators could examine physical evidence, interview witnesses, and reconstruct movements, but they could not completely see what was happening inside the minds of the people involved. What they could determine was that the situation escalated. The two vehicles became connected by conflict. Instead of separating, the confrontation continued. Instead of allowing distance to end the argument, the drivers remained involved with one another. This is one of the defining dangers of road rage. The original problem is often not what causes the tragedy. The tragedy comes from the decision to continue. A driver feels wronged. Another driver responds. The emotions grow. The desire to prove a point becomes stronger than the desire to stay safe. And suddenly, a person is no longer thinking about arriving home. They are thinking about winning. They are thinking about punishment. They are thinking about the other driver as an enemy. But the road does not exist for battles. It exists for movement. The vehicles continued through North Charleston, and according to authorities, Parker Gore followed Faltermeyer's vehicle. What began as a traffic disagreement transformed into something far more dangerous, a moving confrontation between two cars. For Christina, there was no escape. She was inside the vehicle at the center of the conflict. She was surrounded by decisions made by other people. Every second that passed brought the situation closer to a point where it could no longer be controlled. For her daughter, the experience was even more terrifying. A child understands safety through the people they trust. A mother's presence represents protection. A familiar voice represents comfort. But during that drive, the person who was supposed to make the world feel safe became the person who needed saving. The vehicles moved through the roadway while anger continued to replace reason. At some point, the confrontation crossed a line. A firearm entered the situation. And once a weapon became part of the conflict, the possibility of tragedy became real. The decision to use a gun in a road rage incident changes everything. A person can recover from an argument. They can apologize after a mistake. They can walk away from anger. But a bullet cannot be taken back. A single action can create consequences that last forever. Investigators later determined that Parker Gore allegedly fired shots toward the vehicle occupied by Faltermeyer, Christina, and her daughter. The sound of gunfire transformed the entire situation. A moment earlier, it had been a traffic conflict. A moment later, it was a crime scene. Inside the vehicle, Christina was struck by a bullet. The person who had nothing to do with the argument became the person who suffered the greatest loss. The tragedy happened instantly. A mother's life was interrupted. A child's world was changed. A family's future was rewritten. The violence of that moment is difficult to comprehend because of how unnecessary it was. There was no unavoidable danger. There was no threat that required a deadly response. There was no reason a traffic dispute should have ended with someone dying. Christina Colon did not lose her life because of something she chose. She lost her life because someone else chose violence. That distinction is at the center of this case. When people talk about road rage, they sometimes describe it as anger or frustration. But behind those words are real consequences. Road rage is not simply shouting through a window or making an aggressive gesture. It can become a situation where people make decisions that permanently affect innocent lives. Christina became the human cost of that decision. After the shooting, the reality of what had happened began to unfold. The vehicle that had been carrying a mother and daughter became the scene of unimaginable fear and confusion. The people involved were no longer dealing with a disagreement between drivers. They were facing the aftermath of a violent act. For emergency responders arriving at the scene, the priority was clear: help the injured person. But for Christina's loved ones, the moment represented something much more devastating. A phone call. A notification. The beginning of a nightmare they could never escape. Families often remember the moment they learn someone they love is gone. It becomes a dividing line in their lives. Before the call. After the call. Before the tragedy. After the tragedy. For Christina's family, November 4, 2021, became that dividing line. The world before that day contained possibilities. The world after contained questions. Why did this happen? Why did a simple road conflict become deadly? Why did Christina, someone who was not involved, become the victim? Those questions would follow the investigation. They would follow the courtroom proceedings. They would remain long after the headlines disappeared. Because some crimes are difficult to understand not because they are complicated, but because they are so senseless. There was no grand motive. No carefully planned attack. Only a series of choices made in a moment of anger. And the final result was permanent. A mother was gone. A child was left without her. A family was forced to grieve. And a quiet road in North Charleston became the place where an ordinary day ended in tragedy. The investigation was only beginning. Authorities would soon begin examining every detail: the vehicles, the timeline, the witnesses, the evidence left behind. They would search for answers about what happened in those final moments before the gunfire. They would try to understand how a traffic dispute became a homicide. And they would work to hold accountable the people whose actions led to Christina Colon's death. But before the evidence was collected and the legal process began, there was only one undeniable fact. A woman who entered a vehicle that day expecting nothing unusual never made it home. Her life ended not because of her choices, but because someone else allowed anger to become violence. In the aftermath of gunfire, time seems to move differently. For the people who witnessed the violence, everything can happen at once and yet feel strangely slow. A normal moment can break apart into confusion. Sounds become sharper. Movements become faster. People struggle to understand what they have just seen. On November 4, 2021, in North Charleston, South Carolina, a routine roadway became the center of an investigation that would reveal how quickly anger could turn into tragedy. The vehicles that had been traveling through the city were no longer just vehicles. One of them had become evidence. One of them carried the final moments of Christina Brittany Colon's life. And inside that scene were the first pieces of a story investigators needed to reconstruct. When authorities arrived, they were not simply responding to a traffic dispute. They were responding to a violent shooting involving an innocent passenger, a child witness, and two drivers whose actions had led to a devastating outcome. The first priority was obvious. A life had been placed in danger. Emergency responders moved quickly, attempting to provide assistance and understand the situation unfolding around them. But despite those efforts, Christina Colon could not be saved. The woman who had entered the vehicle that day as a mother, a loved one, and a person with a future ahead of her was gone. For investigators, the scene represented the beginning of a difficult process. They needed answers. Who fired the weapon? What exactly happened between the two vehicles? How did a traffic-related confrontation become deadly? And perhaps the most painful question of all. Why was Christina Colon the person who died? Crime scenes often tell stories without words. A damaged vehicle can reveal direction and force. A bullet hole can reveal movement. A position of objects can help investigators understand a timeline. Every piece of evidence becomes part of a larger picture. In a case like Christina's, the investigation was not only about proving what happened. It was about reconstructing the moments before it happened. The moments when the situation could have ended differently. The moments when someone could have chosen to walk away. Investigators began gathering information about the sequence of events. They examined the vehicles involved, searched for physical evidence, and began interviewing those who had witnessed or experienced the confrontation. The challenge was that the incident happened in motion. This was not a crime that occurred in a fixed location, where every detail remained in place. The vehicles were moving. The confrontation unfolded across the roadway. The positions of the cars, the actions of the drivers, and the decisions made in seconds all had to be carefully pieced together. The investigation required more than finding evidence. It required understanding the behavior behind the evidence. What caused the confrontation to continue? Why did the situation escalate? What happened inside the minds of the people involved during those crucial moments? For detectives, the case centered around the relationship between three people inside one vehicle and the driver of another. Christina Colon was the innocent passenger. Her daughter was the child caught in the middle. Austin Blaine Faltermeyer was the driver of the vehicle carrying Christina. And Parker Norman Gore was identified as the other driver involved in the confrontation. Each person represented a different part of the story. Each person held information about what happened. But the most important fact remained unchanged. Christina had not been the person involved in the original disagreement. She was not the reason the confrontation began. She was not the person behind the decisions that led to violence. Yet she was the person who paid the ultimate price. As investigators continued working, they began examining the actions of both drivers. The case was not simply about the moment the firearm was used. It was about everything leading up to that moment. In criminal investigations, events are rarely isolated. A shooting does not begin when the trigger is pulled. It begins with every decision made before that point. A decision to follow. A decision to continue an argument. A decision not to disengage. A decision to escalate. Those choices create the path toward the final act. Authorities believed the confrontation between Faltermeyer and Gore developed into a dangerous pursuit. The vehicles remained connected by anger rather than separated by distance. Instead of becoming another forgotten traffic incident, the situation continued until it reached a deadly point. Investigators also had to consider the presence of Christina's young daughter. A child witness adds another painful dimension to any investigation. Beyond the legal importance of what a witness may have seen, there is the human reality of what that child experienced. A 7-year-old child was present during the loss of her mother. That fact alone changed the emotional weight of the case. For investigators, their work was about evidence. For Christina's family, it was about unimaginable grief. The crime scene was not just a location. It was where a mother's future ended. It was where a child's understanding of safety was forever changed. It was where a family's memories became divided into two parts: life before November 4, 2021, and life afterward. As news of the shooting spread, the community began learning details of what had happened. Many people struggled to understand how a road conflict could lead to a death. Roads are supposed to connect people. They are supposed to take people home. But in this case, the road became the place where someone never returned. The investigation moved forward quickly because authorities understood the seriousness of the situation. A woman had been killed during what appeared to be a road rage incident, and accountability depended on understanding every step of the confrontation. Witness statements became important. Physical evidence became important. The timeline became important. Every second mattered. Investigators needed to know what happened before the shooting, during the shooting, and immediately afterward. The answers would determine how prosecutors approached the case. They would determine which charges could be filed. They would determine how responsibility would be assigned. But even before the legal process began, one thing was already clear. This was not simply a dispute between two drivers. This was a case involving a mother who lost her life, while another person's anger spiraled out of control. As detectives worked through the evidence, the public began asking questions. Could this have been prevented? Could someone have walked away? Could one different choice have saved Christina? Those questions are common after tragedies like this, because people naturally search for a moment where everything could have changed. A different reaction. A different decision. A different ending. But the reality is that once violence begins, the consequences can move faster than anyone can stop. A single action can create a lifetime of pain. For Christina Colan's family, the investigation could never bring her back. No arrest could erase the memory of losing her. No courtroom decision could restore the years she should have had with her daughter. But the investigation represented something important. It was an attempt to tell the truth. To understand what happened. To separate facts from assumptions. To ensure that Christina's death was not reduced to just another headline. Because behind every piece of evidence was a person. Behind every question was a family waiting for answers. And behind every investigative file was the story of a woman whose life ended because a road disagreement became something much more dangerous. The first clues were beginning to form. The vehicles had been examined. The witnesses were being heard. The timeline was slowly being reconstructed. And investigators were moving closer to understanding how a few moments of rage became a tragedy that would never be forgotten. A homicide investigation begins with uncertainty. In the first hours after a violent crime, investigators are surrounded by fragments. A witness remembers a moment, but not every detail. Physical evidence reveals part of the story, but not the emotions behind it. People involved may describe events differently, each seeing the situation through their own perspective. The task of detectives is to take those fragments and rebuild a complete picture. In the case of Christina Brittany Colan, investigators faced a difficult question from the beginning. How did a traffic disagreement between two drivers become the death of an innocent woman? The answer was not hidden in one single piece of evidence. It existed in the timeline. In the movements of the vehicles. In the statements of the people involved. in the decisions made during the moments before the gunfire. The investigation into Christina's death was not only a search for the person responsible for pulling the trigger. It was also an examination of how the confrontation developed and why it continued until it reached a point of no return. Because the shooting was not a random act that appeared without warning. It was the final moment of an escalating situation. Investigators began focusing on the two drivers connected to the confrontation, Austin Blaine Faltermeyer and Parker Norman Gore. Both men became central figures in the investigation. Both had been part of the chain of events that led to Christina's death. And both faced questions about their actions that day. The first challenge for authorities was reconstructing what happened between the vehicles. A road rage incident is different from many other crimes, because the scene itself is constantly changing. The vehicles are moving. The confrontation may happen over several locations. Witnesses may only see a portion of what occurred. Drivers may react within seconds. A person driving behind the vehicles may see one thing. Someone nearby may see another. A driver involved may describe events differently from another person involved. Investigators must carefully separate perception from fact. They must determine what can be proven. The focus was not on assumptions or emotions. It was on evidence. The evidence needed to answer basic, but critical questions. Where did the confrontation begin? What actions did each driver take? When did the situation become dangerous? Who made the decision that transformed a traffic dispute into a deadly encounter? And most importantly, who was responsible for Christina Colan's death? As detectives worked through the case, they examined the circumstances surrounding the initial traffic incident. At its beginning, the conflict appeared to involve a collision, or interaction, between Faltermeyer's vehicle and Gore's vehicle. Under normal circumstances, such an event would have been handled through conversation, documentation, and authorities if necessary. But instead of ending there, the confrontation continued. This became one of the most important parts of the investigation. The original traffic incident alone did not explain Christina's death. The escalation did. Investigators often describe violent events as a sequence rather than a single moment. Every action creates the possibility of the next action. A driver feels offended. The driver responds. The other driver reacts. The conflict grows. The situation becomes more emotional. Eventually, someone makes a decision that changes everything. In Christina's case, the investigation centered on understanding that sequence. Why did the vehicles remain connected? Why did the confrontation continue after the initial incident? Why did someone choose to use deadly force? As authorities gathered information, the details painted a disturbing picture of how quickly ordinary frustration could become dangerous. Road rage cases often involve a specific psychological pattern. A driver may interpret another person's actions as disrespectful rather than accidental. A simple mistake becomes a personal insult. The person no longer sees another driver as a stranger having a bad moment. They see an opponent. A threat. Someone who must be challenged. The vehicle itself can create a false sense of protection. Behind the steering wheel, some individuals feel separated from normal social rules. They may behave in ways they would never consider in another environment. The road becomes a place where pride and anger compete with judgment. And when a weapon becomes involved, the outcome can become irreversible. For detectives, understanding this behavior did not excuse anyone's actions. It helped explain how the situation developed. The investigation also examined the role of Austin Faltermeyer. Although Parker Gore was accused of firing the shots that killed Christina, authorities also looked at Faltermeyer's actions during the incident. According to investigators, Faltermeyer faced his own legal consequences related to his conduct during the confrontation. Authorities believed his actions contributed to the circumstances surrounding the deadly encounter. This made the case more complicated than a simple question of one person versus another. There were multiple decisions, multiple actions, multiple moments that had to be examined. But at the center of everything remained Christina, a woman who had no control over the choices being made around her. A mother who was not involved in the argument. A passenger whose life depended on decisions made by other people. For Christina's family, the investigation represented both hope and pain. Hope because they wanted answers. Pain because every new detail forced them to relive the moment they lost her. Families of homicide victims often experience a complicated emotional journey during investigations. They want justice, but they also have to repeatedly hear about the worst moment of their lives. They wait for updates from detectives. They follow court developments. They hear strangers discuss someone they loved. A victim's family is often forced to experience their grief publicly. Every court document, every news report, every legal argument becomes another reminder that their loved one is gone. For Christina's family, the investigation was not simply about a criminal case. It was about understanding why. Why did someone's anger become more important than human life? Why did a moment on the road end with a mother never coming home? Why did a child have to witness the loss of her mother? These questions are difficult, because there is rarely an answer that feels sufficient. No explanation can make the tragedy acceptable. No motive can make the loss smaller. But the justice system still has a responsibility to uncover the truth. That process requires patience. It requires examining evidence carefully. It requires avoiding assumptions. And it requires allowing the facts to speak. As detectives continued their work, the case began moving closer toward identifying responsibility. The investigation was no longer only about what happened. It was about proving what happened. That distinction matters. In a criminal case, suspicion is not enough. Authorities must build a timeline. They must collect evidence. They must establish actions. They must show how those actions led to the final outcome. Every detail mattered. Every witness mattered. Every piece of evidence brought investigators closer to the truth. The case of Christina Colon was a reminder that violent crimes are often created through moments that seem small at first. A disagreement. A misunderstanding. A burst of anger. But the consequences are never small. For Christina's family, the investigation was an attempt to make sense of something that felt impossible to understand. For law enforcement, it was a mission to reconstruct the events of that day and determine accountability. And for the community watching the case unfold, it became another warning about the danger of road rage. Because behind every aggressive driver is a choice. A choice to escalate or walk away. A choice to control anger or surrender to it. A choice that can determine whether someone gets home safely. Or whether a family receives a phone call that changes their lives forever. The investigation into Christina Colon's death was moving forward. The evidence was being assembled. The timeline was becoming clearer. And soon, investigators would reach the turning point that would define the case. In every major criminal investigation, there is a moment when confusion begins to transform into clarity. At the beginning, there are only fragments. A scene filled with unanswered questions. Witnesses trying to remember moments that happened too quickly. Evidence waiting to reveal what it truly means. For the investigators working on the death of Christina Brittany Colon, the early hours after the shooting were filled with the difficult task of separating facts from uncertainty. A woman had been killed. A child had witnessed the violence. Two drivers were connected to a confrontation that had escalated beyond control. But the most important question remained. Who was responsible for turning a road dispute into a deadly act of violence? The answer would not come from one single discovery. It would come from a combination of evidence, statements, and reconstruction of the events that occurred on that November afternoon. Slowly, the picture began to form. The investigation revealed that Christina's death was not the result of a random attack. It was connected to a confrontation between two drivers that had continued far beyond the point where it should have ended. The conflict had a beginning. It had a series of decisions. And it had a final moment when a firearm changed everything. For investigators, understanding that sequence was essential. Because in cases like this, the question is not only who caused the final injury. The deeper question is how the situation reached that point. What choices created the path toward violence? What actions made the tragedy possible? The evidence began pointing toward Parker Norman Gore as the person accused of firing the shots that killed Christina Colon. Gore, who was 24 years old at the time, became the central figure in the homicide investigation. Authorities alleged that after the road confrontation escalated, Gore used a firearm and fired toward the vehicle carrying Christina, her daughter, and Austin Faltermeyer. The consequences of that decision were immediate and permanent. A bullet did not recognize who was involved. It did not separate the people who were arguing from the person who was simply nearby. It struck Christina, the person who had nothing to do with the dispute. That fact became one of the most heartbreaking elements of the case. The investigation showed that Christina was not the target of the original anger. She was not the person behind the conflict. She was not the person whose actions had caused the confrontation. She was caught in the middle of someone else's rage. As authorities continued gathering evidence, the case moved from a question of what happened to a question of accountability. Investigators worked to establish the timeline of events. They examined the movements of the vehicles. They reviewed information provided by witnesses. They studied the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Each detail helped create a clearer picture of the moments leading up to Christina's death. The investigation also continued examining Austin Faltermeyer's role. The situation was complicated because the case involved more than just the person accused of firing the weapon. Authorities believed that Faltermeyer's actions during the confrontation also contributed to the dangerous situation that developed. This raised difficult questions about responsibility. In a chain of events, responsibility can exist at different points. One person may create the conflict. Another person may escalate it. Another person may make the final decision that causes tragedy. The justice system would eventually have to examine each person's actions separately. But for Christina's family, those legal distinctions could never change the most painful fact. Christina was gone. The legal process could determine guilt. It could determine punishment. But it could not restore the future she had lost. It could not give her daughter back the years she should have had with her mother. It could not erase the memory of that day. The breakthrough in the investigation was not just identifying suspects. It was understanding the true nature of what happened. This was not a planned attack against Christina. It was not a personal revenge against her. It was something far more frightening. It was a moment of uncontrolled escalation. A situation where anger was allowed to grow until someone made a choice that could never be reversed. Road rage cases often reveal how quickly human judgment can collapse under intense emotion. A person becomes focused on being right. They become focused on proving a point. They become focused on the other person's mistake. But in doing so, they lose sight of the consequences. They forget that the other vehicle contains real people. People with families. People with futures. People who expect to arrive home. Christina Colon represented the human cost of that failure. She was the reminder that road rage is not simply an argument. It is not simply frustration. It is not simply someone driving aggressively. It can become a deadly form of violence. As investigators moved closer to formal charges, the case began attracting wider attention. Many people were shocked by how quickly the situation had escalated. The question repeated across the community was simple. How could a traffic dispute lead to a woman's death? The answer was painful because it was also familiar. Too often, tragedies begin with moments people believe are insignificant. A disagreement. A gesture. A perceived insult. Something that could have ended with a person taking a breath and moving on. But instead, someone chose escalation. And the result was irreversible. For Christina's family, the investigation brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief that authorities were working toward accountability. There was anger that such a senseless loss had occurred. There was sadness knowing that no legal outcome could change the reality of their lives. They had to continue without Christina. Her daughter had to grow up without her mother. The family had to learn how to live with an absence that could never be filled. The breakthrough in the case represented progress, but it also reopened the wound. Every new piece of information reminded them of what they had lost. Every court filing carried Christina's name. Every mention of the case brought them back to November 4, 2021. The day that changed everything. As the investigation developed, prosecutors began preparing for the next stage. The evidence would need to be presented. The accusations would need to be tested. The people involved would have their day in court. And a jury, if the case reached trial, would eventually be asked to determine responsibility. But before the courtroom battles began, investigators had already uncovered the central truth of the tragedy. Christina Colon's death was the result of a confrontation that never should have reached that point. A conflict that could have ended differently. A moment where someone could have chosen restraint. Instead, it became a case about consequences. About accountability. And about the devastating impact of allowing anger to control a person's actions. The investigation had found its direction. The suspects had been identified. The evidence was coming together. And the next chapter would move from the streets of North Charleston into the courtroom, where the question of justice would finally begin. For Christina Brittany Colon's family, the courtroom was never going to be a place where they found peace. No verdict could bring Christina back. No sentence could erase the memory of the day she died. No legal decision could give her daughter the chance to grow up with her mother by her side. But the courtroom represented something important. It represented accountability. It represented the moment when the actions that led to Christina's death would be examined under the law. After months of investigation, the case moved beyond the streets of North Charleston and into the legal system. The questions that had surrounded the tragedy would now be debated through evidence, testimony, and legal arguments. What happened on that road? Who was responsible? And what consequences should follow from the choices made that day? At the center of the case was Parker Norman Gore. Authorities accused Gore of being the person who fired the shots that struck Christina during the road rage confrontation. The charges against him reflected the seriousness of what had happened. A woman had been killed during an incident that began as a traffic dispute and escalated into deadly violence. The prosecution's case focused on the sequence of events. A disagreement on the road. An escalation between drivers. A pursuit. A firearm. And a fatal outcome. The argument from prosecutors was built around the idea that the tragedy was not an unavoidable accident. It was the result of decisions made by individuals who had the ability to stop the confrontation before it became deadly. The law does not judge only the final moment. It examines the actions that lead to that moment. Every choice. Every step. Every decision that moves a situation closer to violence. For the prosecution, the central issue was that a traffic conflict did not need to become a shooting. The situation could have ended differently. Someone could have slowed down. Someone could have walked away. Someone could have chosen not to escalate. But instead, according to investigators, the confrontation continued until a gun was introduced. And when the weapon was used, Christina Colon became the victim. The defense, as in many criminal cases, had the responsibility of challenging the prosecution's version of events and examining the evidence carefully. Courtrooms are designed to test accusations, not simply accept them. Every piece of evidence must be questioned. Every witness must be examined. Every claim must be proven according to legal standards. That process can be emotionally difficult for families, because the courtroom often forces them to hear painful details about the death of someone they love. The person they remember through happy memories becomes discussed through evidence and legal language. A mother becomes a case file. A daughter becomes a victim. A life becomes a timeline. But behind every legal argument was the same reality. Christina Colon was a real person. She had a family. She had a child. She had a future that ended too soon. The case also involved Austin Blaine Faltermeyer, the driver of the vehicle carrying Christina and her daughter. Authorities examined his actions during the confrontation and determined that he also faced criminal consequences related to his conduct. This added another layer of complexity to the case. It was not simply about identifying the person who fired the weapon. It was also about understanding how the entire situation developed. A tragedy like this does not happen in isolation. It happens through a series of moments. A disagreement becomes an argument. An argument becomes a confrontation. A confrontation becomes violence. The courtroom had to examine those moments one by one. For Christina's loved ones, the most painful part of the case was likely knowing that the entire tragedy began with something so ordinary. A road interaction. A traffic issue. Something that millions of drivers experience every day. But most people continue driving. Most people reach their destination. Most people go home. Christina did not. That contrast made the case especially difficult for many people following it. The violence was not connected to a long-standing personal conflict. It was not the result of years of planning. It was a sudden explosion of anger. A moment where emotions overcame judgment. And the person who suffered the greatest consequence was the person least responsible. Christina's daughter was a reminder of the human cost behind the legal proceedings. While attorneys discussed evidence and charges, a child was facing a reality that would follow her for the rest of her life. She would grow older without her mother. She would experience milestones without Christina being there. Graduations. Birthdays. Important conversations. Moments when many people naturally turn to their parents. Those moments would always carry the absence of someone who should have been present. That is why justice in cases like this is complicated. The law can punish a person responsible for causing harm. But it cannot repair every piece of what was broken. It cannot restore lost time. It cannot remove painful memories. It cannot replace a mother. Still, the pursuit of justice matters, because accountability recognizes the value of the life that was lost. A conviction or legal judgment is not only about punishment. It is also society's way of saying, this person mattered. This life mattered. What happened was wrong. Christina Colan's death was not something that could simply be dismissed as a traffic accident. It was the result of human choices. And those choices had consequences. As the legal process continued, the case became part of a larger national conversation about road rage violence. Across the United States, incidents of aggressive driving had increasingly become associated with serious injuries and deaths. The question many people began asking was not only about this case. It was about the culture of anger on the road. Why do some drivers feel the need to respond with aggression? Why does a mistake behind the wheel become something personal? Why do some people allow a temporary emotion to create permanent damage? Christina's story became a powerful reminder that every vehicle on the road contains a human being. A person with a family. A person with people waiting for them. A person whose life has value. The courtroom proceedings were about one specific case, but the message extended beyond North Charleston. A moment of anger can last seconds. The consequences can last generations. For Parker Gore, the legal system would determine his responsibility. For Christina's family, the process was about honoring her memory and seeking justice for a life that should not have ended. And for everyone who heard her story, the case served as a warning about the dangerous space between frustration and violence. Because the distance between an argument and a tragedy can be incredibly small. Sometimes, it is measured in seconds. Sometimes, it is measured in one decision. And sometimes, that one decision changes everything. The courtroom would eventually deliver its judgment. But long before the final legal outcome, one truth was already undeniable. Christina Brittany Colan should have been alive. She should have been watching her daughter grow. She should have been creating new memories. She should have continued the story of her life. Instead, her family was left asking for justice. And the world was left remembering how a normal day on a South Carolina road became a tragedy that never should have happened. After the investigation ended, after the evidence was collected, after the courtroom proceedings began to move forward, there remained something no legal system could ever fully repair. The absence of Christina Brittany Colan. For the people who loved her, the days after November 4, 2021, were not measured by court dates or police updates. They were measured by the moments when reality returned again and again. The moment waking up and remembering. The moment reaching for a phone and realizing there would be no message from Christina. The moment seeing another mother with her child and feeling the weight of what had been taken away. Grief does not arrive only once. It returns in waves. Sometimes it appears during important events. Sometimes it appears during ordinary moments. Sometimes it comes unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a place, a memory, or something as simple as seeing someone who reminds a person of the loved one they lost. For Christina's family, the tragedy was not limited to the day she died. The tragedy continued every day afterward. Because when a person is killed suddenly, the people left behind must continue living in a world that no longer feels complete. The cruel reality of sudden loss is that life around the grieving family does not stop. Cars continue driving. People continue going to work. Children continue going to school. The world continues moving forward even when one family feels as if their entire world has stopped. Christina Colan was 32 years old when she died. A mother. A daughter. A loved one. A woman who had many years ahead of her. Her death left behind questions that may never have satisfying answers. Why did this happen? Why did a traffic disagreement become violent? Why did someone choose to continue a confrontation instead of ending it? Why did Christina, who was not part of the argument, become the person who lost everything? These questions are common after senseless tragedies, because human beings naturally search for meaning. People want to believe that terrible events have logical explanations. They want to believe there is a reason. A warning sign. A clear moment when someone could have stopped what was coming. But sometimes the truth is more painful. Sometimes tragedy happens because someone makes a decision that should never have been made. The aftermath of Christina's death also carried another heartbreaking reality. Her daughter survived. But surviving a traumatic event does not mean escaping it. A child who witnesses violence involving a parent carries an experience far beyond ordinary childhood fears. The memories may change over time, but the emotional impact can remain. A child should remember a mother's smile, a mother's voice, a mother's hugs, a mother helping with homework, celebrating birthdays, and sharing everyday moments. Instead, Christina's daughter experienced the moment her mother was taken away. That is a loss that cannot be explained simply. It is not only the loss of a person. It is the loss of a future relationship. A child grows and changes every year. Every stage of life brings new moments when a parent's presence matters. The first major achievement. The first difficult decision. The moments when a child wants advice. The moments when they need comfort. Christina should have been there for those moments. She should have been able to watch her daughter grow. She should have been able to celebrate the person her child would become. But someone else's anger removed that possibility. That is what makes Christina's story especially painful. Her death was not the result of a situation where she knowingly placed herself in danger. She did not enter an argument. She did not choose confrontation. She was simply present. And sometimes, the most terrifying aspect of violence is realizing that innocence does not always provide protection. A person can do everything right and still become a victim. A mother can simply ride in a car with her child and never make it home. The community reaction following Christina's death reflected the shock many people felt. Road rage incidents are often dismissed as moments of frustration. People hear stories about angry drivers and aggressive behavior, but they may not imagine those situations becoming deadly. Christina's case forced people to confront the reality that road rage is not harmless anger. It can become violence. It can become criminal. It can destroy families. The highway where people normally think about destinations and daily routines became a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change. For investigators, the case represented a completed mission of seeking answers. For prosecutors, it represented the pursuit of accountability. For Christina's family, it represented something much more personal. It represented the loss of someone they could never replace. No courtroom decision could recreate the sound of Christina's voice. No punishment could restore the years stolen from her. No verdict could give her daughter back the childhood she deserved. Justice could acknowledge the wrong, but it could not undo it. That is one of the hardest realities in homicide cases. The justice system can respond to a death. It cannot reverse one. The people left behind must carry both the memories and the pain. They must find ways to honor the person who is gone while continuing their own lives. And continuing does not mean forgetting. In fact, for many families, remembering becomes a form of survival. They remember the person before the tragedy. They remember the laughter, the personality, The small details that made that person unique. Because a victim should never be remembered only by the way they died. Christina Colon was more than a headline. More than a case number. More than a name connected to a road rage shooting. She was a person whose life had meaning long before November 4, 2021. She had relationships that mattered. She had people who loved her. She had a child who needed her. Her life was valuable because of who she was, not because of the tragedy that ended it. The aftermath of the case also raised a broader question about human behavior. Why do people allow moments of anger to control their actions? Why does being insulted on the road sometimes feel more important than protecting human life? Why does someone decide that proving a point matters more than walking away? The answer is complicated. Anger is a powerful emotion. It can narrow a person's thinking. It can make temporary feelings seem permanent. It can make a person focus so intensely on the moment that they forget the future consequences. But the people affected by those decisions do not get a temporary consequence. They live with permanent ones. A person may experience anger for seconds. A family may experience grief for decades. That imbalance is at the heart of Christina Colon's story. A few moments of rage created a lifetime of pain for everyone who loved her. As time passed, Christina's name remained connected to a message that extended beyond her own case. Walk away. Do not escalate. Remember that every person on the road has a life. Every driver is someone's family member. Every passenger is someone who matters. The vehicle beside you is not just another object. There is a person inside. Someone with dreams. Someone with responsibilities. Someone who expects to return home. Christina expected that too. She expected another ordinary day. She expected more time. She expected to continue being a mother. Instead, her life ended because someone else failed to control a moment of anger. And that is why her story remains so powerful. Not because of the violence alone, but because of what was lost. A mother. A future. A family's sense of normal life. Christina Brittany Colon's story is a reminder that behind every road rage incident is a human cost. Behind every statistic is a family. Behind every victim is a life that mattered. And behind every tragedy is the question that remains long after the investigation ends. What would have happened if someone had simply chosen to walk away? Months after the shooting that took Christina Brittany Colon's life, the physical evidence had been collected, the investigation had moved forward, and the legal process had taken its course. The vehicles involved were no longer sitting at the center of a crime scene. The flashing lights were gone. The road had returned to its normal rhythm. Cars continued to pass through North Charleston. Drivers continued their daily routines. People continued moving from one destination to another. But for Christina's family, nothing was normal anymore. The world around them continued forward, but their lives had been permanently changed. This is one of the most difficult realities of sudden loss. A tragedy can divide life into two completely different periods. There is the time before. Before the phone call. Before the news. Before the moment everything changed. And then there is the time after. After the loss. After the questions. After learning how quickly an ordinary day became the worst day of their lives. For Christina's loved ones, November 4, 2021, became that dividing line. Before that day, Christina was a living presence in their lives. After that day, she became a memory they had to protect. The challenge for families of homicide victims is that grief is not only about losing someone who existed in the past. It is also about losing the future they were supposed to have. When a person dies naturally after a long life, families still experience pain, but they often have years of memories to look back on. When someone is taken suddenly and violently, there is another layer of suffering. There are unfinished conversations, unanswered questions, dreams that never became reality. Christina was only 32 years old. She was not at the end of her story. She was still creating it. She was still raising her daughter. Still building relationships. Still experiencing the ordinary moments that become meaningful only after they are gone. A mother's life is often made up of small moments that others may never notice. Preparing a meal. Helping a child through a difficult day. Listening to stories. Celebrating achievements. Offering comfort. Those moments rarely appear in news reports. They do not become part of police investigations. But those moments are what define a person. And those were the moments Christina's daughter lost. The tragedy of Christina's death was not only that she was killed. It was that someone who loved and cared for others was suddenly removed from their lives. A family lost a person who could never be replaced. The community lost someone who still had more to give. And a child lost the opportunity to grow up with her mother. Beyond the personal grief, Christina's case became another example of a growing concern across America, the danger of road rage. Road rage is often described casually. People joke about angry drivers. They tell stories about someone cutting them off in traffic. They complain about someone driving too slowly. They describe frustration as if it is harmless. But there is a difference between frustration and rage. Frustration is a feeling. Rage is a decision. The feeling itself is human. Every person experiences anger. Every driver has moments where another person's actions create irritation. But the critical moment is what happens next. Does someone let the emotion pass? Or do they allow it to control their behavior? That difference can determine whether an incident ends with everyone going home, or whether it becomes a tragedy. The case of Christina Colon demonstrated how quickly a conflict can move from ordinary to catastrophic. A traffic disagreement did not remain a traffic disagreement. It became a confrontation. The confrontation became violence. And violence created permanent consequences. One of the most disturbing aspects of road rage cases is the illusion that the situation is personal when it is not. A driver may believe another person has disrespected them. They may believe they need to respond. They may feel they cannot allow someone else's actions to go unanswered. But the reality is that most traffic conflicts are temporary. The frustration disappears. The driver's separate. The moment is forgotten. Unless someone decides that the anger deserves more. That is where danger begins. In Christina's case, the consequences of escalation were not temporary. The anger of one moment became the grief of many years. This is the part of road rage that is often ignored. The person who acts in anger experiences one moment. The victims and families experience everything that comes afterward. A few seconds of aggression can create decades of pain. That imbalance is difficult to comprehend. For the person who loses control, the incident may be brief. For the family left behind, the consequences become part of their entire future. Christina's story also raises questions about responsibility. Responsibility is not only about the final action. It is about recognizing the power of choices. Every person behind the wheel has moments when they can choose another path. They can slow down. They can stop engaging. They can ignore an insult. They can choose safety over pride. Those choices may feel small. But sometimes small choices are the difference between life and death. The tragedy of Christina Colon was that she never had the opportunity to make those choices. Her fate was determined by the actions of others. She became the innocent person caught between anger and consequence. That is why her story continues to affect people who hear it. Many people can imagine themselves in a similar situation. Not as the driver involved in the argument, but as the passenger. The person simply sitting in a vehicle. The person trusting that a normal journey will remain normal. The thought that a stranger's anger could suddenly change everything is deeply unsettling. Because it reveals how fragile ordinary life can be. A person can leave home expecting nothing unusual. A child can sit beside a parent expecting safety. A family can expect someone to return. And then, in a moment, everything changes. The legacy of Christina Colon's case is not only about remembering how she died. It is about remembering why she mattered. It is about seeing her as more than the victim of a crime. She was a mother whose child loved her. She was a person whose presence mattered. She was someone who deserved more time. More memories. More life. Her story also serves as a warning about the responsibility that comes with driving. A vehicle is powerful. A decision made behind the wheel can affect more than the person making it. Every driver shares the road with strangers who have their own lives, families, and stories. The person in the next lane may be someone's parent, someone's child, someone's best friend, someone who is expected home that night. Christina was expected home. But she never arrived. That fact is what makes her story impossible to forget. A road is supposed to lead people forward. It is supposed to connect places. It is supposed to bring people back to the ones they love. But on November 4, 2021, one road in North Charleston became the place where a family lost someone they could never replace. And the reason was not a complicated mystery. It was not an unavoidable accident. It was a moment when anger was allowed to become something far more dangerous. Christina Colon's name remains a reminder of what can happen when people stop seeing each other as human beings. When another driver becomes an enemy instead of a stranger. When winning an argument becomes more important than protecting a life. Her story asks everyone who hears it to consider a simple question. Is any moment of anger worth destroying another person's future? For Christina's family, the answer will always be no. Because they know the cost. They know what remains after the anger disappears. Silence. Memories. And a life that should have continued. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For Christina Brittany Colon's family, November 4, 2021, was that moment. Before that day, there was a future filled with possibilities. There were plans that had not yet happened, conversations that had not yet taken place, and memories that had not yet been created. After that day, there was only the reality they never wanted to accept. Christina was gone. A mother was gone. A daughter was gone. A loved one was gone. And the people who remained had to find a way to continue living in a world that suddenly felt incomplete. The criminal investigation focused on evidence, timelines, and responsibility. The courtroom focused on charges and legal consequences. But for Christina's family, the most important part of the tragedy was not found in documents or testimony. It was found in the empty spaces left behind. The empty seat at family gatherings. The missing voice during conversations. The absence of someone who should have been there. Loss changes the way people experience ordinary life. Things that once felt normal can suddenly become painful reminders. A birthday can become a reminder of who is missing. A holiday can become a reminder of an empty place at the table. A child's achievement can become a reminder of the parent who should have been there to celebrate it. For Christina's daughter, the loss was even more profound. At only 7 years old, she experienced something no child should ever have to experience: the violent loss of her mother. Children understand the world through relationships. They understand safety through the people who protect them. A mother is often one of the first and strongest sources of comfort in a child's life. A mother is the person a child runs toward when they are scared. The person they look for when they need reassurance. The person whose presence can make a difficult moment feel manageable. Christina was that person for her daughter. And then, in one terrible moment, that security was taken away. The emotional consequences of witnessing such a traumatic event can follow a person for years. The memory of what happened may change as the child grows older, but the impact of losing a parent remains. There are questions that may appear later in life. Questions about what happened. Questions about why it happened. Questions about the person her mother would have become as the years passed. A child who loses a parent does not only lose the present. They lose the future they were supposed to share. They lose the advice they would have received. The encouragement they would have heard. The conversations that would have happened during important moments. Christina should have been there for those moments. She should have watched her daughter grow into the person she would become. She should have celebrated achievements, offered guidance during difficult times, and shared countless ordinary days that later would have become precious memories. Instead, those moments became possibilities that would never happen. That is the invisible damage caused by violent crime. The impact is not limited to the moment of death. It continues through every year that follows. A victim's life ends, but the consequences continue through the people left behind. For Christina's family, grief was not something they could simply finish. It became something they had to carry. People sometimes talk about grief as if it follows a predictable path. As if there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. But grief after sudden violence does not work that way. It changes. Some days may feel manageable. Other days may bring the pain back with the same intensity as the beginning. A memory can appear unexpectedly. A familiar place can reopen old emotions. A simple thought can bring back everything that was lost. And unlike many other difficulties in life, grief cannot be solved. It can only be carried. The family members who loved Christina had to face a painful contradiction. They wanted to remember her. But remembering also meant acknowledging that she was gone. They wanted to keep her presence alive. But every memory was also proof of the absence they had to live with. This is the complicated reality of losing someone suddenly. The person becomes both a source of comfort and a source of pain. The memories bring happiness, because they show the love that existed. But they also bring sadness, because those moments cannot happen again. Christina's death also affected the way many people viewed road rage. Before tragedies like this, some people think of aggressive driving as simply rude behavior. Someone shouting through a window. Someone driving too closely. Someone making an angry gesture. But Christina's story showed the extreme danger hidden within uncontrolled anger. The person in another vehicle is not just another driver. They are a human being. They have people waiting for them. They have responsibilities. They have someone who loves them. Christina was proof of that. To the person accused of causing her death, the confrontation may have lasted minutes. But for Christina's family, the consequences would last a lifetime. This difference is one of the most painful aspects of violent crime. The person responsible may eventually face the legal system. But the victims' families face something much longer. They face the reality of waking up every day without the person they lost. They face anniversaries. They face memories. They face the future without someone who should have been part of it. The justice system can assign punishment. But families must still live with absence. That is why remembering victims is so important. Because a person should never be reduced to the worst moment of their life. Christina Colan's story did not begin on November 4, 2021. It began years earlier. It began with relationships. With love. With the role she played in the lives of others. The tragedy is that many people learned her name only because of the way she died. But the people who truly knew her remembered something different. They remembered Christina as a person. A mother. A family member. Someone who mattered. The purpose of telling her story is not to focus only on the violence. It is to recognize what the violence destroyed. A future. A relationship between mother and daughter. A family's sense of normal life. The moments Christina would never experience. The moments her daughter would never share with her. Every homicide creates a victim, but it also creates a circle of pain around that victim. Parents lose children. Children lose parents. Families lose loved ones. Communities lose people who should have had more time. Christina's case was especially painful because of how unnecessary it was. There was no reason a mother should have died that day. There was no reason a child should have witnessed such trauma. There was no reason a traffic conflict should have changed so many lives forever. And that is what remains after all the investigations and legal proceedings. Not just the facts. Not just the evidence. But the human cost. A woman who should still be alive. A daughter who should still have her mother. A family that should never have had to experience such loss. Christina Brittany Colan's story is ultimately a reminder that every person on the road carries a life that matters. Every stranger has a story. Every vehicle contains someone who is loved. And every decision made in anger has the potential to affect far more people than the person making it. For Christina's family, the question will always remain the same. What would life look like if that confrontation had ended differently? If someone had walked away? If someone had chosen patience? If someone had remembered that the person in the other vehicle was human? Because sometimes the greatest tragedies are not caused by complicated plans. They are caused by moments when people forget how valuable another life truly is. The story of Christina Brittany Colan is not only the story of one tragic afternoon in North Charleston. It is also part of a much larger and deeply troubling pattern. Across the United States, roads and highways have become places where ordinary disagreements sometimes transform into violent confrontations. What begins as frustration over a lane change, a near collision, or a perceived insult can escalate into threats, physical attacks, and in the worst cases, murder. The death of Christina Colan forced many people to confront an uncomfortable truth. A vehicle is not just a machine. It is an environment where emotions, decisions, and human behavior collide. Every day, millions of people drive alongside strangers. They share the same roads, the same intersections, and the same moments of frustration. Most of the time, those moments disappear almost instantly. A driver is cut off. Someone makes a mistake. Someone becomes angry. Then everyone continues. But sometimes, someone refuses to let the moment go. Sometimes, anger becomes more important than safety. Sometimes, a person stops seeing another driver as a human being and starts seeing them as an enemy. That transformation is where danger begins. In Christina Colan's case, the original conflict was not something that should have changed anyone's life forever. A traffic-related incident, regardless of who was responsible, should have been something that ended with distance between the vehicles and everyone continuing on their way. Instead, the confrontation continued. The anger remained. And the consequences became permanent. One of the most disturbing parts of road rage violence is how quickly it can happen. There is often no long preparation. No long history between the people involved. No complicated motive. A person can wake up in the morning with no intention of harming anyone, then encounter a frustrating situation, and make a decision that changes multiple lives forever. That is why road rage is so unpredictable. It is not always about who was right. It is about whether someone allows emotion to override judgment. Human beings experience anger naturally. Anger itself is not unusual. Everyone has moments of frustration. Everyone has moments when they feel disrespected. Everyone has moments when they believe another person has acted unfairly. But emotions are temporary. Actions are permanent. A person may feel anger for a few seconds. A family may suffer the consequences for generations. That imbalance is what makes cases like Christina's so devastating. The person who feels the anger experiences a moment. The victims experience the aftermath. For Christina's daughter, the consequences are not measured in minutes. They are measured in birthdays without her mother. Milestones without her mother. Years of growing up without the person who should have been beside her. This is the reality that is often forgotten when people talk about aggressive driving. The focus is usually on the drivers involved. The argument. The confrontation. The exchange of anger. But the victims are often the people who never participated. Passengers. Children. Bystanders. People who happened to be nearby. Christina represented that reality. She was not the person involved in the disagreement. She was not the person controlling the situation. She was simply there. And because someone else lost control, she lost everything. Her death also highlights the danger created when firearms become part of emotional conflicts. A disagreement that might have ended with words becomes something completely different when a weapon is introduced. A firearm removes the possibility of recovery. A person can apologize for an angry comment. They can regret a rude gesture. They can repair damage caused by careless words. But once a trigger is pulled, regret cannot reverse the outcome. The bullet does not know the difference between the person involved in the argument and the innocent person sitting nearby. It does not understand intention. It only creates consequences. That is why Christina's story became such a powerful reminder of restraint. Walking away is not weakness. Choosing not to respond is not surrender. Sometimes the strongest decision a person can make is refusing to allow a temporary emotion to control their actions. The road does not need winners and losers. A driver does not need to prove superiority over another person. There is no victory in arriving home after causing someone else never to return. The tragedy of Christina Colan's death also raises questions about how society handles anger. Modern life often encourages immediate reactions. People respond instantly. They communicate instantly. They become frustrated instantly. Behind the wheel, this tendency can become dangerous because drivers are surrounded by speed, isolation, and a sense of anonymity. Inside a vehicle, some people feel protected. They feel separated from consequences. They may believe their actions are less serious because they are happening on the road. But the road is still a public space. And every decision made their affects real people. The driver next to you may be carrying a child. The person behind you may be going home to a family. The person you are angry with may be someone's entire world. Christina Colon was someone's entire world. Her daughter did not see her as a headline. Her family did not see her as a statistic. She was a person whose presence mattered. The broader lesson from her case is not simply avoid road rage. It is deeper than that. It is about recognizing humanity in moments of frustration. It is about remembering that every person around us has a life that continues beyond our brief interaction with them. A driver who makes a mistake is still a person. A stranger who annoys us is still a person. A person in another vehicle is not an obstacle. They are someone with their own fears, responsibilities, dreams, and loved ones. Christina's death became a painful example of what happens when that recognition disappears. The investigation, the arrests, and the court proceedings all focused on accountability after the tragedy occurred. But the most important prevention would have happened before the tragedy. Before the pursuit. Before the confrontation. Before the weapon. Before the moment that changed everything. It would have happened when someone chose to stop. When someone chose not to continue. When someone decided that being angry was not worth risking another human life. Because the truth about road rage is simple. Nobody wins. Even the person who believes they have proven their point loses something. A life is gone. Families are destroyed. The consequences follow forever. The road eventually returns to normal. Traffic continues. Cars continue passing. People continue driving. But the families affected by road rage violence never return to the way things were. For Christina's family, the road where she lost her life will always represent more than pavement and vehicles. It represents the moment everything changed. It represents a mother who should still be here. It represents a child who should still have her mother's guidance. It represents a reminder that anger can create destruction far beyond the moment that caused it. Christina Colon's story continues to carry a message that reaches beyond one city and one case. Slow down. Think before reacting. Remember the person beside you. Because sometimes the difference between a normal day and a tragedy is only one decision. And that decision can determine whether someone makes it home.